Hello there, folks, and welcome to this episode of the Whitfield Report. I am your host, Sam Whitfield, coming to you on Tuesday night, November 13th, 2018, to do an impromptu podcast. As many of you know, folks, this podcast is usually political in nature. However, as I've said many times before, this podcast also deals with lots of popular culture stuff too. As Andrew Breitbart once famously said when he was alive, politics is downstream from culture. And he was absolutely right. So I do talk a lot about pop culture and entertainment as well on this podcast. And I really can't think of anything more relevant to talk about today, especially considering my personal life and my personal background. Folks, there's no other way to say it. Stan Lee, basically the godfather of comic books, and one of my personal childhood heroes, passed away at age 95, which is really incredible that he lived to 95 alone. That in and of itself is a big deal. And then when you couple that with the fact that he pretty much created the Marvel comics universe, and for almost a total of 60 years oversaw the creation and development. I mean, at least for the first 30, arguably, he built the universe. Of course, there were other writers and whatnot who came on afterwards, but at least from the 50s to the mid to late 70s, he was the main brainchild of Marvel Comics. And he was a hugely influential figure on many people. And I know this is pretty cliched to say at this point, because it feels like we hear this all the time when a celebrity or public figure passes away, right? We always tend to hear that, oh, so-and-so was a huge influence on my life, or so-and-so had a big influence or changed my life, or, impacted me in some way. And I usually don't say that about too many celebrities or public figures. But in the case of Stan Lee, folks, this really was true. Many of you who have been longtime listeners and who know me personally know that I'm a huge comic book fan, particularly of the Marvel Universe, and particularly of the characters that Stan Lee created when he was heading up Marvel. Characters like Spider-Man, Daredevil, Iron Man, the rest of the Avengers, so on and so forth. Growing up, comic books were a huge part of my life. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again. I first became interested in comics back when I was, really, since I can remember, way back when the Denver Post, which is the newspaper in Colorado, when I was growing up, they used to run the Spider-Man comic book, the weekly comic strip that Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. wrote. They used to run that in the Denver Post when I was a kid. at least until I was like in 3rd or 4th grade. I think they stopped. I think the Post lost the rights to circulation or whatnot. You can still find it online, but I know for a fact that the Post circulated the Spider-Man newspaper strip at least for the first few years when I was reading, and I would read the comic strips, and that was how I more or less got interested in reading. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously I learned how to read in school, but comic strips and later on comic books were a huge part of that. And my dad would take me to the comic shop every Saturday to get some new comics as a kid, and that was wonderful and exciting because I had no idea that there was I thought newspaper strips were the bee's knees already. I was in Valhalla when I discovered that they had entire shops full of comic books, that they made whole books and you could buy several issues of them. And, most kids binge watch Netflix. Now, I used to binge read comic books when I was a kid. So it was hugely influential when I was a little kid. And then when I was eight or 9, comic books became even more important to me because around the time I was 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, that was when my parents got divorced. I was 8 when it happened. And folks, divorce is always hard for the child. There's no doubt about that. And for me, it was particularly hard because I had still have a physical disability that has made me wheelchair bound, as many of you know. And so, unlike most kids who could take out their frustration or pain, or just their general emotions about a divorce with something like sports or, athletics or whatnot, or, I couldn't do any of that. I couldn't run away from home if I wanted to. I couldn't, sneak out or do anything. So comic books were really my refuge in comic culture. And really from the time I was a preteen, around, 10 or so, to really my, to the middle of my teenage years, that was really when I read comics and really learned more about myself, and I was really able to identify with some of the struggles that these characters in the Marvel Universe, particularly Spider-Man, went through. I know it's another cliche that, lots of kids relate to Spider-Man, but it is indeed true, especially, teenage boys. I know I'm kind of jumping around here too, but Spider-Man is obviously Stan Lee's most well-recognized creation, and I think the reason for that is because, particularly for teenage boys, he is so identifiable. Early on, and they keep rebooting this, story over and over again. Peter Parker is basically a high school nerd who, has trouble in school, has trouble with girls, has trouble making friends, all the things that, teenage boys back in the 60s who are nerds and, today. Not even nerds now, just, teenage boys in general all have to struggle with. And, Peter Parker was and still is a way, lots of us can relate to him. And the fact that he was able to, become Spider-Man and, have these amazing powers despite all of, his struggles and, the death of his Uncle Ben and whatnot, and still balance his life as a superhero and a high school student, that was fantastic in the sense of the fantastical, but yet it was equally relatable. And that was the success of Spider-Man. And, in the case of one of my favorite heroes, Daredevil also suffers from a crippling disability and blindness. And yet his blindness doesn't stop him from being not only a great hero, but a great lawyer as Matt Murdock. And, lots of people always say, well, don't you identify with Professor X more? And I would say, sure, because Professor X is in a wheelchair. But Professor X was also a professor, too. He was well-to-do. Daredevil is more of a, the common man, the everyday hero, still kind of like Spider-Man with a, disability, and he also was able to do great things. Daredevil Season 3, by the way, I've talked about Daredevil before on one of my old podcasts, but Season 3 is amazing. I'll maybe see if I can get a panel on that later on, either this year or next year, depending on how the year for the podcast wraps up. But anyway, back to Stan Lee. So many of his characters were fantastical, yet just so relatable. He was able to do a perfect balance, which is what made the Marvel formula successful. But it was also very groundbreaking what he did, because back in the 50s, up until, Lee started to shake things up, teenagers were sidekicks. And even the full-grown adult heroes were, even Batman to that point. He hadn't really, Batman back then in the 40s and 50s was not the Batman we think of now. He was still kind of very lighthearted, very, didn't have a lot of flaws, was kind of impervious. And, the typical superhero was just an alpha male who had powers and who was very macho and would always win against the bad guy, and the odds were, mostly related to the villain and the superpowers, and it was all, very cut and dry, and the hero would always win at the end of the day, and, it was, the comic book industry became formulaic after a while. Lee really shook up the way comic books were, the way these stories were told. He basically put real life, people in these stories, gave them powers, but allowed them, and in some cases forced them to still keep their human flaws despite these powers. And that was what made him so successful. But I would also say that it was what made him a controversial figure at times. I mean, I guess you could say, like I said, this isn't a political episode, but we do talk about free speech versus censorship law on this show. And I guess in a sense, you could say that Stanley was a champion for free speech and the expression of ideas and anti-censorship, particularly because there's one famous instance that you can read about in his autobiography where Stanley, back during the mid-60s, I think it was, basically there was this academic professor, and they're always causing problems, as we all know. There was this professor who had written a paper on how comic books were making kids violent, or how it could lead to violent behavior. Sound familiar, folks? We've only heard about this, with video games or toy guns or whatever have you. And so, the fun police were demanding that comic books be censored, and Lee fought a pretty hard battle for quite a few years to show us that his comic books, although they covered, tough adult topics like drug use and like alcoholism with Iron Man and whatnot, that they not only were worth telling, but that they should be told, because they could be used as a way to teach kids about good moral characters while also being relatable to adults. And obviously, we know how that turned out. Obviously, Stanley won at the time. This was very controversial that he took these big, complex subjects that a lot of people, particularly back in the 50s and 60s, didn't think kids could handle. Didn't think they had the wherewithal to handle these tough topics. He was able to take these really complex subjects, put them in complex stories, and yet be relatable to the reader who may have been 8 years old all the way up to the 20-year-old college student who may have been reading them, and now obviously beyond too. And when you look back at some of those stories, yeah, I mean the wording and the way he wrote things, may have been full of alliteration and whatnot. They were certainly colorful. The dialogue may have been hokey at times, but the ideas behind these stories were really, really deep. And obviously, a lot of Stanley's, stories and the origin stories they created for many of these characters was very deep as well. So, as far as an influence, from my childhood, Stanley and the comic books he created were a huge, huge part of my life growing up, and that can't be, I can't state that enough. Now, what a lot of people may not know about how Stanley inspired me, and I don't think I've shared this with anyone before, but Stanley also had a huge influence on me as a creative person. Not a lot of people know this. In fact, I don't think I've ever shared this on my podcast before. But around the time my parents got divorced, and even shortly thereafter, once I got into junior high / middle school, whatever the kids are calling it these days, I also became inspired due to reading Stanley's autobiography, which I think is called Excelsior. I became inspired to write superhero short stories. And so I distinctly remember when I was in middle school, at least in my 6th and I believe in my 7th grade year, the English class that I had, we always had free writing time, where we were basically allowed to write anything we wanted, but we had to write in these classes for a couple minutes, each time at the beginning of class and submit our stuff. So I basically created my own superhero universe where I had characters and fictional cities. Sometimes I remember I would do my own fictionalized version of Denver, Colorado, where I grew up, much like Stanley, did his own fictionalized version of New York, and I would spin these tales, and I had my own superhero universe, and it was a great outlet for me to use my imagination, and I loved it. Can't remember any of the characters that I created or really any of the stories I created anymore. I do remember that one of the other things I used to do, along with that, I would always, because it was hard for me to write these stories out on pen and paper, I would record these stories onto an old fashioned cassette recorder. This was 2005, 2006 when I was doing this, so pre-podcasting era for sure. But even so, I guess you could say in a way, doing this narrative, story got me used to talking into a microphone. At the very least. So, I guess in that sense it does tie into podcasting. And so, writing these short stories, these superhero stories, and creating my own universe, in a sense, inspired me to, continue to write creatively. Now, obviously, since I'm older, I've switched into genres like political thrillers. That's mainly the genre that I've self-published in. But I have often gone back and I've thought about maybe creating another more complex superhero universe. Now I am an adult. I don't know. I don't know if that really genre for written superhero literature is actually a thing. Although I couldn't make a thing. I'm just kind of thinking out loud now about that. Regardless, by the way, I don't have any of the stories that I wrote because they were all saved on an old laptop, on an old Dell laptop that I had used in middle school, and it died at some point along the way. It was like when I got it, it was pretty old to begin with. It was like it was like my first laptop, and it was like one of those huge, I think it was like 4 or 5 pounds at least, and it was really thick. I remember that for sure. And back in those days, back in my day, you youngins, we didn't have cloud storage, or backups, and the backups that were out there, they were all very expensive. So none of those stories got backed up, regrettably. Even so, though, I imagine that I would want to start all over again, because I can almost guarantee you that anything that was written by a 6th grader or a 7th grader at the time, is obviously it's not going to win me any writing awards, that's for sure, because it was written for. Basically, I wrote these stories for myself, but as I said, Stanley influenced that part of me, and to this day, I mean, I don't write fiction as much as I used to, mainly because I don't have time between college and doing this podcast and whatnot. But when I do, in the back of my mind, I always think of how much Stanley influenced my creative writing process to begin with. So, really, like I said, in terms of, influence, Stanley really did influence me on multiple levels. I'm not just saying that. He's one of the few celebrities who I would say really did have an influence on my life. Now, as far as his death goes, let me just say this. Obviously, I'm sad, like many of you. Strangely enough, though, I'm not really mourning. Obviously, the fact that we've lost an icon is indeed sad, but as I said at the beginning of this podcast, the guy lived to be 95, which is a feat in and of itself, and he continued working, as far as I know, on various projects right up until the day he died, and we may, depending on what those projects are, I don't know, I hadn't really followed him in a while, but depending on what those may have been, we may get to see, some of his final work come to fruition in the next few years. Knowing him, he probably hired a good staff, so there's a good chance of that. I also know that he had some lawsuits going on and some, legal problems with like an abusive, elder care taker, and also he had lawsuits against Marvel and whatnot. I don't want to focus on those. Other podcasts and other media outlets will obviously focus on, the controversies and whatnot, because they love to do that. But as I said, Stan is my childhood hero. I'm not going to tarnish him that way personally. I'm also not going to be reading any of this, stuff from the outrage mob on what a bad or horrible person Stanley is. A couple of people have, tweeted me links saying, "Oh, did you see what this blogger what they said about Stan Lee being, a horrible human being?" And look, folks, let me just say this. I mean, I'm sure that Stan Lee's not perfect. He's infallible like the rest of us. He was human. But, at the same time, these outrage mob folks, they love to get outraged because, that's why they're called outrage mobs. And so if you've done anything successful, anything, worth sharing, even on the small level, like I have, if you have anything worth sharing with people creatively or otherwise, there are always going to be people who are opposed to you or outraged by you. Because it's 2018 and we live in the age of social media, and no matter what political aisle you're on, or, religious or cultural background or whatever, it seems like someone is always going to be, pissed at you for something. And Stanley is no exception. I guess the fact that people are outraged by him, that tells me that he's doing something right because, he made a legacy, and there are people who are obviously going to be pissed off by that because they're too stupid and miserable with the condition of their own life that they have to, shit on a great man like Stan Lee. And like I said, I'm not going to let any of these losers tarnish my childhood hero. I may read some of these later on just to kind of amuse myself, and if I do read them, I'll probably tweet reply at some of you. Maybe I'll write something up later. I don't know. A couple of you sent me links to these though, asked me to comment on them, and let me just say this: I'm not going to give Stan Lee's haters the time of day, so as to read these specific outrage columns, just because they don't deserve them. They don't deserve these outrage mobs don't deserve my attention. I'm kind of already giving them too much attention, just by talking about them. So, I'm just going to continue celebrating Stan Lee's life and legacy and the good work that he did creatively. Obviously, he was flawed like the rest of us, but I'd like to think that he was a good man, and I certainly know that he made my life better through the stories that he wrote and told, and he just made the world brighter all in all, and he will be missed. And I'm looking at the shelf behind me. I just looked over there a moment ago, and I looked at the boxes of comic books that I have on there. Some of them I haven't read in ages, but I know a lot of them were written by Stan Lee. And like I said, I'm not really grieving because he lived a long life, and at 95, he certainly deserves to rest in peace. But at the same time, I just do find it a little sad that my childhood hero has passed on. And I know many of you are too, so I just wanted to share my experience, what Stan Lee meant to me, and just to share with the audience that, like many of you, I too miss Stan Lee. He was a great man, and he will be missed. So rest in peace, Stan. Excelsior. Also, real quick before we go, I do want to give a quick shout out. Not that he needs promotion, because his podcast has infinitely more listeners and infinitely more downloads than I do as of this time. But I would like to recommend that if you're interested in hearing a fascinating interview with Stan Lee, my good Twitter buddy Christian Bladt, who is a former show producer for Dennis Miller's old radio show. He was lucky enough to interview Stan Lee on a couple of occasions. I remember Stan Lee actually called into the Dennis Miller show a couple times over the years, the old radio show. And Dennis and Stan would talk, which to me is equally fantastic because Dennis Miller, another icon, another huge influence on my life in terms of pop culture. Those two together, man, it was fantastic. But I know that Christian got to interview Stan Lee a few times, and So he recently put out an episode of his podcast, the Blackcast, basically replaying those interviews. So go check those out wherever wherever you can find podcasts, and I'll link to Christian's episode in the podcast description, because like I said, even though he doesn't really need the shout out, I'm going to give it to him anyway because he's an awesome guy. But anyway, folks, I will be back for Thursday, and hopefully we'll have a regular show by then. Hopefully this election stuff will be figured out by then. So thank you very much for listening to this impromptu podcast. I just kind of hit the record button and rambled on for the past 35 minutes, but I appreciate you sticking by me and just allowing me to pour my heart out to you. Excelsior, ladies and gentlemen, God bless, and thank you for listening to the Whitfield Report.